What would you do if the only thing left to you by the grandmother you loved was a battered sewing table so worm-eaten and lopsided that the auctioneer would not even set a price on it? Alice Shaw, 20 years old, and lately orphaned of the last kin who had ever spoken her name kindly, inherited exactly that. A warped walnut table with a cracked veneer, one drawer that stuck, and a reputation in the family for being the ugliest piece of furniture in 3 counties. But what she would find hidden inside it, before the month was out, would tilt the whole district of Muirfold on its axis and cost her more than she yet knew she owned. Settle in. Stay close. This one asks for a little patience, and it repays every minute of it. The cart brought her into Muirfold on a Wednesday afternoon, in a thin, grey rain that felt more like breath than weather. Alice sat with her knees pressed together and her hands folded on the flat parcel across her lap, watching the hedgerows drag past in ragged green lines. She had not slept properly in 11 nights. She had counted them. The last 4 had been spent in a room above a coaching inn at Barrow-on-the-Mere, where she had waited for her grandmother's estate to be read aloud by a solicitor who did not once meet her eye. There had been little to read: a brass thimble, a prayer book with a broken spine, £12 and 6 shillings in a tin, most of which went to settle the burial, and the sewing table. The rest, the cottage at Whitton Lane, the small annuity, the good linen, had gone by prior deed to her Uncle Bertram, who had appeared at the reading in a new black coat and did not stay for tea. Alice had signed her name where the solicitor pointed. She had thanked him in a voice she did not recognize. Then she had walked out into the wet street and stood a long moment beside the cart, while the driver lashed the table down beneath a square of oilskin, and she had thought, quite clearly, that she was now a person with no address. Muirfold was where her grandmother had been born. Alice had visited only twice, both times as a child, and remembered chiefly the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a river she never saw. She had chosen it because the loyal old friend she had left in the world, Hetty Marle, who had once been in service beside her mother, kept a small cottage on the Muirfold road and had written back within the day. "Come," Hetty's letter said. "Come and stay while you decide what a girl of 20 is meant to do next." The cart stopped at Hetty's gate as the church bell struck 4. Hetty came out in a grey shawl and took Alice's hand with both her own and did not speak for a moment, and Alice was grateful for it. Behind them, the driver hauled the sewing table down off the boards with a grunt, set it upright on the path, and stepped back as though he had done his duty by an unpleasant guest. "That the whole of it?" he said. Not a question. "That is the whole of it," Alice replied. He touched his cap and drove off, and the rain thickened, and Alice stood looking down at the thing her grandmother had left her, and felt for the first time since the funeral something that was not grief but curiosity, small but there, like a match struck under wet straw. They carried the table into Hetty's parlor and set it beside the window. In the grey afternoon light it looked worse than it had in the solicitor's office. The walnut veneer had lifted in 3 places along the top, curling like dead leaves. One leg had been badly mended with a plate of tin nailed on with square iron nails. The drawer that faced the room had a keyhole with no key, and would not open when Alice tried it, though she felt it shift under her hand, as though something inside had moved. Hetty stood back and folded her arms. "Your grandmother hated that table," she said. Alice looked up. "Did she?" "She would not sew at it. She kept her needles in a box on the sill. That thing sat in the back scullery, covered by a sheet for 30 years. "Then why keep it?" Alice asked. Hetty was quiet. She looked at the table as if it had asked her a question she did not want to answer. Then she said, "Some things a person keeps because throwing them out would say more than they wish to say." Alice remembered that line later. She did not press it then. They ate a plain supper of bread, cold mutton, and stewed apple, and Hetty made up a bed for Alice in the small upstairs room where a tortoiseshell cat named Muffet had been dozing on the coverlet and did not move to be disturbed. Alice sat on the edge of the bed and stroked the cat's flank and listened to the rain on the slates and thought about the table downstairs. By morning, the news had already gone round the lane, as news does in a place like Muirfold, where 3 cottages share one washing line. Alice came down to find a farmer's wife at the door on a pretext of returning a bowl, and behind her a boy with a face full of freckles pretending to fetch water from the pump. Both of them craned to see through the parlor window. "Is that it?" the woman said, not troubling to soften her voice. "That the inheritance." "That is it," Hetty said, blocking the door with her body. The woman laughed, one hard bark of it, and turned to go. "A poor day's work for the coach fare," she said over her shoulder. "I'd have burnt it for the warmth." By noon, a man Alice would later learn was called Mr. Rufus Bardsley, a portly landholder from the far side of the parish, who thought himself the finest wit in the district, had walked past the cottage twice and gone on to the Greenbell to declare, in the hearing of 6 farmhands and a curate, that the Shaw girl had come to Muirfold on the strength of an heirloom fit only for kindling, and that she would be gone again by Michaelmas. "A worm-eaten table," he told the room. "That is her fortune. That is her claim." He laughed until his waistcoat shook. "Let us pity the poor creature and be done with her." The laughter reached Hetty's cottage by way of the butcher's boy. Alice heard it out without moving, seated at the parlor window with her hand resting on the sticking drawer. She did not weep. She did not answer. She only looked down at the table, at the tin plate on its leg, at the curled veneer, at the little brass keyhole that had no key, and felt, very quietly, that the whole of the village was wrong. Why would a grandmother keep for 30 years an object she refused to use? What was inside a drawer that would not open? And what would a girl of 20, with no home and no money and no name in Muirfold, choose to do with a piece of furniture the whole parish had already condemned to the fire? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and if a story of quiet defiance is the kind you like, leave a like and stay subscribed. Because that afternoon, alone in Hetty's parlor, Alice went for a knife. The knife was a thin paring blade Hetty kept in a jar of forks by the hearth. Alice took it to the parlor and knelt beside the table with the calm of a person who has already decided that the worst has been done to her and cannot be done again. She slid the blade along the seam of the drawer, worked it in 1/4 of an inch, and felt the wood give, not the give of a stuck runner, but the give of something wedged deliberately behind the front board. She stopped. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the brass keyhole with no key and understood that it had never been a keyhole at all. It was a decoy, a plate of brass to draw the eye away from what the true opening actually was. Alice ran her fingers along the underside of the drawer front and found, near the left corner, a small wooden peg no larger than a rye grain. She pressed it. Something inside the table clicked, small and clean, like the tick of a clock announcing an hour no one had been waiting for. The drawer facing the room did not move, but a shallow tray she had never seen before slid an inch out from the back of the table, opposite the false front, silent as a drawn breath. Inside the tray was a single folded document, brown at the edges, and a length of black ribbon. Alice did not unfold it in the parlor. She could not have said why. She only closed the tray, pushed the peg back into its seat, and sat for a long moment with her hand flat on the walnut top, listening to the rain against the window and to Hetty moving quietly in the kitchen. When she carried the paper upstairs, she carried it as one carries a candle through a drafty passage. By the small window of the upstairs room, with Muffet warm against her thigh, Alice opened the document. The ink had faded to the color of weak tea, but the hand was firm and clerkly. A conveyance, a deed of gift, dated the 9th of April, 1839, transferring to one Margaret Ann Shaw, her grandmother, unmarried at that date, the full title of a house and grounds known as Longhollow, situated in the parish of Nettlebridge, 3.5 miles beyond the boundary stone of Muirfold. Signed, sealed, witnessed by 2 names she did not know. Alice read the paper twice. Then she folded it back into its creases, slid it inside the prayer book with the broken spine, and lay a long while looking at the ceiling. The next morning she went to the village on foot. She wore her mended boots and her gray shawl, and she asked at the post office and at the wheelwrights whether anyone knew of a house called Longhollow beyond the boundary stone. The wheelwright shook his head slowly. The postmaster's wife pursed her mouth and said she did not think there was any such place, though the name had a familiar ring, and folk did like to give grand titles to any ruin with a chimney left standing. In the market square, a knot of women looked up as Alice passed, and one of them, the freckled boy's mother, Alice guessed by the freckles, nudged her neighbor and said something behind her hand that made both of them laugh. Mr. Rufus Bardsley was standing outside the Green Bell in a fawn waistcoat, holding a walking stick as though it were a rod of office. He saw Alice cross the square and raised the stick in a mock salute. "The heiress," he called, "come to survey her lands." The men behind him laughed dutifully. Alice did not slow her step. She did not look at him. She only tightened her hand around the prayer book in her pocket and walked on. "A word of counsel, Miss Shaw," Bardsley said after her, loud enough for the square. "There is a coach on Friday. A girl your age should not linger where she has no people and no place. Muirfold is a small parish. It has no charity to spare for driftwood." Alice kept walking. She did not see the old woman at first. The woman was seated on the low stone bench beside the churchyard gate, wrapped in a black shawl the color of wet slate, her hands folded over the head of a hawthorn cane. Only when Alice drew level did the woman lift her chin and look at her directly, and Alice stopped without meaning to, as if the look had a small hand in it. "You are the Shaw girl," the old woman said. "I am," Alice answered. The woman studied her a long moment. Her eyes were the pale gray of an old bowl. Behind her the church wall was damp with lichen. "They gave her the table," the old woman said, "so she would not ask about the house." Alice did not speak. The old woman lifted her cane, tapped it once against the flagstone, and gave the smallest nod, as though closing a door on a room she had opened only far enough to let one word through. "Go carefully by Nettlebridge Road," she said. "Ground remembers what people forget." Then she rose, slow but unbowed, and walked off between the yew trees without looking back. Alice stood at the gate a full minute before she could move again. When she returned to Hetty's cottage, the rain had begun in earnest, and she did not speak of the encounter, only sat at the parlor table and asked Hetty whether there was any cart going out toward Nettlebridge in the next few days. Hetty looked at her and did not ask why, and said she would see. 2 mornings later, before first light, Alice climbed into the box beside a carter named Wilkin, who was hauling barrels of tallow to a chandler at Nettlebridge, and had agreed, for the price of a loaf and a shilling, to set her down at the boundary stone and pick her up again on his return trip the following afternoon. She carried a small canvas satchel with bread, cheese, a stub of candle, a tin cup, her grandmother's prayer book, and the deed folded inside it. Muffet had followed her to the gate and would come no further. Hetty had lent her a walking stick with a brass ferrule that had belonged to her father, and Alice took it without knowing yet how much she would come to lean on it. The country beyond Muirfold rose in low green folds. Hedgerows dripped with the night's rain. Rooks rose in loose black skeins over the ploughed fields. The sky was the color of unpolished pewter, and the wind carried the smell of wet hawthorn and coal smoke from some cottage chimney miles off. Wilkin did not talk much. He hummed a slow tune under his breath and let the horse pick its way through the ruts. At the boundary stone he drew up. The stone was a squat granite marker with the letter M cut deep on the near face and the letter N on the far, both crusted with pale lichen. Wilkin pointed with his whip along a track that ran off to the west between two overgrown hedges. "Half a mile that way," he said. "There is a lane. Take the left fork at the ash. You will find what you find." Alice climbed down. She thanked him. He nodded, clicked his tongue at the horse, and the cart went on. She stood a moment in the wet grass beside the stone. The wind moved in the hedgerows. Somewhere ahead, a wood pigeon called twice and stopped. She adjusted the strap of the satchel, took a firmer grip on the brass ferruled stick, and started along the track. The lane narrowed quickly. Bramble reached from the hedges to catch at her skirt. Nettle crowded the ruts. She passed a fallen gate whose hinges had rusted into the wood of the post, and a barn whose roof had gone in over the beams, and a well capped with a slab of moss-covered slate. The land was not empty exactly. It was inhabited by absence, which is a different thing. A land that has been left. At the ash tree, bare, its bark silver with age, the track forked. Alice took the left. The lane climbed a shallow rise and then dropped, and as she came over the crest, she stopped, one hand at her mouth, without her knowing it had gone there. Longhollow stood in a shallow bowl of ground, ringed by neglected chestnut trees. It was a long, low manor of gray stone under a slate roof gone dark green with moss. 2 chimneys stood. 2 had fallen. The front elevation had 8 tall windows, of which 6 were shuttered with warped boards, and 2 were only open sockets fringed with ivy. The porch had lost its steps. A stone urn on the balustrade had toppled and lay in halves in the wet grass. The whole house leaned very slightly toward the west, as if it had been listening a long while in one direction, and had forgotten how to stand straight. For a long moment, Alice did not move. She had not, until that moment, allowed herself to believe there would be a house at all. The village had been so certain there was not. The deed had felt at Hetty's window, like the record of a joke played by the dead upon the living. But there it was, solid, silent, waiting. She walked down into the bowl. The porch would not take her weight, so she went round to a side door whose lock had rotted out of the frame. It gave under her palm with a slow whisper of swollen wood. Inside was the smell she had expected. Damp plaster, mouse, cold soot, and beneath those a faint, dry ghost of lavender that made her breath catch, because it was the smell of her grandmother's linen press in the cottage at Whitten Lane, 30 miles and 11 years away. She stood in the passage and let her eyes learn the dark. The floor was flagstone, uneven, gritty with fallen plaster. A staircase rose to the left, its banister missing 3 balusters. To the right, an open doorway showed a long room with a broken window and a great fireplace choked with a nest of jackdaws. Water had come in through the ceiling in the corner and left a black bloom on the wall the shape of a spread hand. Everywhere the paper hung in strips. Alice walked the ground floor slowly, room to room, and by the time she had come back to the passage, the light through the broken shutters had turned the color of thin milk. Whatever the deed said, whatever the old woman at the church gate had meant, the house itself said only what such houses always say to those who come to them alone, that it had been left, and that no one had come, and that it did not yet know whether she was another visitor or a keeper. She chose a small room at the back, perhaps a housekeeper's parlor once, she thought, because its single window still held its glass and its door still closed. She swept a corner clear of plaster with the side of her boot. She unrolled the wool blanket Hetty had folded into the satchel. She set out the bread and the cheese and did not eat them. She lit the candle stub in the tin cup, and the flame steadied, and by its small light she read the deed one more time, and then she folded it back into the prayer book and lay down in her clothes on the blanket with her hand around the brass ferrule of the stick. She did not sleep for a long while. She listened. The house spoke as such houses speak, a slow creak in the passage, the settling of a beam, a drip somewhere on the floor above, the wind moving in an empty chimney with a low breath like a person almost about to say a word. Somewhere in the fields, a fox called. Twice. Alice lay with her eyes open in the dark and thought of the old woman's voice at the churchyard gate. They gave her the table, so she would not ask about the house. She thought of her grandmother's hands, which had sewn every stitch of her own childhood clothes at a chair by the sill and never once at the walnut table under its sheet. She thought of the tin plate nailed to the leg with square iron nails and wondered, for the first time, who had nailed it there and why. When at last she slept lightly, and the house went on speaking around her in its patient, injured voice, as if it had been waiting for someone to come at last and learn its language. She woke to a color of light she had not seen in any other house. It came in through the small window like watered milk poured slowly, and it lay on the flagstones in a pale square that shifted as the sun climbed. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then she felt the brass ferrule under her palm, and the stiff prayer book against her hip, and the cold that had settled through the blanket into her bones. And she remembered. She sat up. The candle in the tin cup had burnt itself out in the night and left a bead of tallow the shape of a tear on the rim. Alice rose slowly. Her back ached. She ate a corner of the bread and a small piece of the cheese standing in the doorway of the little back room, looking out into the passage, which was a different passage in the morning than it had been at dusk. Dust turned in the light. A jackdaw called from a chimney. She wiped her hands on her skirt and went this time, room by room in the daylight. She began with the long room to the right of the front door, the one whose fireplace was choked with the jackdaw's nest. She had seen it the day before as an injured shape only. In the morning light, she saw its bones. The paneling had once been oak and painted a soft green, now sunk almost to the color of moss. The ceiling had a plaster rose above where a chandelier had been. Along the far wall, a line of picture hooks still stood in the plaster, and beneath each hook, a faint clean square told her where a frame had hung. Someone had taken the pictures down, not thrown them, not smashed them, taken them down carefully from their hooks. She crossed the passage to a smaller room opposite. A dining room, she guessed, by the shape of it, and by a long scar in the floorboards where the leg of a heavy table had once dragged. The shutters here had rotted at their hinges, and one had fallen inward and lay across the boards like a dropped lid. Alice stepped over it. She meant to look at the window frame, to see how bad the damp had gone, and it was in bending down to the sill that she saw the thing that did not fit. At the corner of the sill, in the soft wood where the paint had lifted, Someone had once cut 2 letters with the point of a knife. They were small, no larger than the nail of her little finger, and worn nearly out. M.A.S. She looked at them for a long time without moving. Margaret Ann Shaw, she was almost sure. Then she looked at the letters again, and she saw that the M had been half cut away by a later, deeper mark. A rougher scoring, done with something blunter, as if a person had come along afterwards and tried to obliterate the initials and had grown bored or been interrupted before the work was done. Alice touched the letters with the tip of her finger. The wood was cold. She sat back on her heels. She did not act. She had learned that already about herself in 3 days, that when a thing surprised her, she did not go running after it. She rose, went out into the passage, and made herself walk on. She looked at the staircase and the missing balusters, at the black hand shape of damp on the wall, at a door that would not open, at another door that opened onto a scullery with a copper still bolted to its brickwork. She did not go back to the sill, but her mind stayed with it. The initials had been cut by a young hand, she thought. She could not have said why, and the scoring over them had been done in anger. She went outside into the wet grass and stood looking up at the leaning west wall of the house, and thought of the tin plate nailed to the walnut leg with square iron nails, and thought that someone had tried, in 2 different places 30 miles apart, to cover a name. That evening, when she had walked back up the track to the boundary stone and Wilkin had come as he had said he would, and she had ridden home under Hetty's shawl in a rain that had begun again at dusk, she said nothing of the initials. She said only that the house stood, and that it was in a poor state, and that she would need to go again. Hetty set a bowl of broth in front of her and did not press her. Muffet climbed onto the bench beside Alice and pushed her small, square head against Alice's elbow until Alice put down the spoon and laid her palm along the cat's back. "There is work in it," Alice murmured. "There is always work in a house," Hetty said. "That is what a house is." Alice slept that night in the upstairs room without dreams, and in the morning she rose before Hetty and went into the parlor and looked a long while at the walnut table by the window, at the tin plate on its leg, at the false brass keyhole, at the curled veneer along the top. Then she went into the kitchen and asked Hetty for the loan of a scrubbing brush, a bucket, a hand broom, a tin of yellow soap, and a pair of leather gloves that had belonged to Hetty's father along with the stick. Hetty gave her all of it without a question, and added a pair of thick wool stockings and a second candle. For the next fortnight, Alice went to Long Hollow 3 days out of every 7, riding as far as she could with whichever cart Hetty could find, walking the rest. Wilkin took her twice more. A tinker with a spotted mare took her once. A curate's boy going as far as the ash tree took her the 4th time and would not accept payment. On the days she stayed at the manor, she did not attempt anything grand. She began at the side door where she had first come in and worked outward, 1 room at a time, the way her grandmother had once taught her to darn a stocking, from the edge inward, never from the middle. She swept plaster into piles and carried it out in a wooden pail. She cleared the passage flagstones down to their honest gray. She scrubbed the sill of the housekeeper's parlor with yellow soap until the wood came back the color of pale bread. She pulled ivy and ropes from the 2 open window sockets and stacked it on the porch to dry for burning. She lifted the fallen shutter out of the dining room and set it against the wall. She did not touch the jackdaws in the great fireplace, because it was still their nesting season, and she thought a house should not be rid of the only tenants who had stayed loyal to it. She worked in Hetty's father's leather gloves, and when the palms of them wore through at the seam, she stitched them with linen thread by candlelight in the small back room at night. She kept the brass ferruled stick propped always within reach, at the wall by whichever door she was working nearest. It leaned when she leaned, rested when she rested, waited when she went out. She spoke to it once or twice without meaning to, "Come along then," as she had heard old countrymen speak to a dog they trusted absolutely. It made no answer, and she was glad of that. It was enough that the brass ferrule caught the light in the corner of her eye whenever she looked up from a scrubbed board or a swept hearth, as if to say, "Still here." The clues came to her through her hands before they came to her through her mind. In the long room, when she brushed away years of soot from a corner of the great mantelpiece, she found a small oval of paler stone set into the greater gray, an inlay the size of a lady's palm, engraved with a fern, and beneath the fern, cut into the stone in the same small hand as the initials on the dining-room sill, the single word, Long Hollow. In the housekeeper's parlor, when she washed the window frame down to its wood, she found on the underside of the sill a row of 6 penciled numbers, tallied like a servant's count of laundry, and dated in a hand she almost knew. April, 1839. The month of the deed. In the scullery she lifted a copper lid off the still and found beneath it a bundle of dried lavender tied with a black ribbon that was the twin of the ribbon from the hidden tray in the sewing table. She stood holding it a long moment. The lavender still smelt faintly of what her grandmother's linen press had smelt of. She set the bundle back where it had been and closed the lid and pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. On the staircase she found, in the plaster of the wall where the missing balusters had been, 3 neat square holes at the exact spacing of the iron nails in the walnut table's tin plate. Someone had once mounted something to that wall at the height of a young woman's shoulder and pulled it down again, and the wall had never been mended. She stood on the 3rd step and set her fingers into the holes and thought of the tin plate and of the initials and of the scoring over them. And she understood, in a way she could not yet have put into words, that whoever had wished this house forgotten had been very thorough and not quite thorough enough. By the end of the 2nd week, her palms were blistered under the linen mendings of the leather gloves. Her boots were caked to the ankle, and she had lost half a stone she could not spare. She looked at herself in the dim square of Hetty's parlor mirror one night and did not recognize the face. Thinner, browner about the cheekbone, a smut of soot along the jaw. She washed. She ate what Hetty put in front of her. She went to bed. She did not tell Hetty yet about the fern, or the numbers on the sill, or the bundle of lavender, or the 3 neat holes on the stair. She wanted, for a little longer, to keep the house and its slow speaking to herself. Only once, as she blew out the candle on the 3rd Sunday since her arrival, did she say aloud into the dark of Hetty's upstairs room, so quietly that Muffet on the coverlet only twitched an ear, "You were kept from me on purpose." She did not know yet which she was speaking to, the house or the woman who had left her the table, or the country between them that had let it happen. But she was speaking to something, and something, in its patient, injured voice, was already beginning to answer. That night she did not sleep well, and on the Monday she went back to Long Hollow with a crowbar borrowed from the wheelwright and a new candle in her pocket. She had woken in the small hours, convinced there was a room she had not read properly, and the room she meant was the housekeeper's parlor where she slept each night. She stayed at the Manor. She had swept its floor, scrubbed its sill, mended the loose pane of glass with a strip of oiled paper. She had not lifted its boards. She began at the corner where the black stain of damp had reached in under the skirting, because damp finds what wants to be found. The first board came up under the crowbar with a soft, complaining sigh. showing joists dark with age and a gap of about a hand's breadth between the boards and the beaten earth beneath. The second board came up more easily. Under the third, set neatly into the earth on a bed of dry lime, lay a small iron box no larger than a family Bible, with a hasp and a small brass padlock furred green with time. Alice did not lift it at once. She sat back on her heels, wiped her hands down her apron, and looked at the box for a long moment in the thin light that came through the papered pane. Then she reached in, took it by its handle, and drew it up onto the boards. The padlock gave to the crowbar with less resistance than it deserved. The lid rose on hinges that had not been oiled since before her birth. Inside, wrapped in a piece of flannel that had been dusted with dry lavender and was still faintly sweet, were three things: a small ledger bound in soft red leather, a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon exactly like the one from the sewing table and the one under the copper lid, and folded flat beneath them, a single sheet of paper on which someone had written in a large, slanting hand, "For Margaret, when they no longer have the strength to prevent her." Alice read the sheet twice and set it aside on the boards. She untied the ribbon of the letters. The topmost was dated the 2nd of February, 1839. It was addressed to my dear goddaughter Margaret, and signed by a woman named only as her Aunt Susanna. The hand was firm and slightly shaky in the way of the elderly. In the letter, Aunt Susanna wrote that she had at last resolved to do what she had been considering these 2 years. She would leave Long Hollow to Margaret, because Margaret had a face at 17 that already knew how to keep its own counsel, and because a woman ought to have, once in her life, a roof that belonged to her before it belonged to anyone else. Alice read on. There were 9 letters. In them, over the course of that spring, Aunt Susanna recorded, plainly and without ornament, the fight that followed the reading of her intention. Margaret's father, whom Aunt Susanna called only my brother, had come to her in his black coat and told her the gift was improper, that a young, unmarried girl could not be given a country house, that the parish would call her ruined by it, that no man of standing would take her if she came with land in her own name. Aunt Susanna had answered that this was precisely the point. Margaret's brothers had come next, one after the other, on separate afternoons, each with a version of the same speech. Aunt Susanna had refused to alter the deed. The last letter was dated the 27th of April, 1839, 18 days after the deed was signed. Aunt Susanna wrote in it that she was tired, that she did not expect to see another summer, and that she was sending the deed itself to Margaret in a sewing table she had bought for the purpose from a cabinet maker at Barrow-on-the-Mere, because a sewing table was the one piece of furniture a father would not think to search. She had asked the cabinet maker to build a false drawer with a decoy plate. She had asked him to fit a peg no larger than a rye grain. She wrote at the end, "You will keep the house or you will keep the paper, my dear, but you will keep something they cannot take back with a signature." Alice sat on the boards with the letter in her hand and did not move for a long time. The little red ledger, when she opened it, was a plain house book kept by Aunt Susanna in the last year of her life. Coals ordered, a mare reshod, a girl paid a shilling for scrubbing the scullery, lavender cut and dried in July. On the back page, in a different, younger, rounder hand, a hand that had cut MAS into the dining room sill, someone had written only, "I could not. Forgive me." Alice pressed her fingers to her mouth. She thought of the walnut table under a sheet in a scullery for 30 years. She thought of her grandmother sewing at a chair by the sill and never at the table. She thought of the tin plate hammered over what she now understood must have been an inlay like the fern on the mantelpiece, a small oval of pale stone naming the house, hammered flat by a brother who wanted the name gone and had been almost thorough enough. The house had not been a secret kept from Alice by chance. It had been a secret kept from her grandmother's own courage by everyone in the house Margaret had grown up in, and her grandmother, unable to reclaim it, unable to give it up, had passed the whole silent problem down through a warped walnut table to the only person left in the line who might still be young enough and poor enough to have nothing left to lose by opening the drawer. Alice folded the letters back into their ribbon. She put the ledger and the letters and the sheet of paper into the flannel and the flannel into the box. She closed the box and set it on the boards beside her. Then she put her forehead against her knees and cried, once, for perhaps a minute without sound. When she lifted her face, she wiped it on her sleeve, replaced the floorboards, tapped down the nails with the flat of the crowbar, and set the iron box on the sill of the mended pane, in the light, where it belonged. She said aloud to the empty room, "I will not put you back under the floor." The wind rose that afternoon before she had finished sweeping the passage. It came from the west along the shallow bowl of ground and pushed through the 2 open window sockets in the front elevation with a low, steady note, like a hand drawn across the mouth of a jar. Alice went out onto the porch that had lost its steps and looked at the sky. The cloud had come up so quickly she had not marked it, a bruised gray lid drawn tight from the moor beyond Nettlebridge to the chestnut ring above the house. The chestnuts were already turning their leaves silver side up. She thought of Wilkin, who was not due until the following afternoon. She thought of the 3.5 miles of open track between Long Hollow and the boundary stone. She thought of the iron box on the sill and of the housekeeper's parlor whose door still closed, and she made her choice quickly and without argument. She would stay. She went back inside, drew the side door to as far as its warped frame allowed, and began carrying what dry firewood she had gathered into the housekeeper's parlor, stacking it in the corner opposite the sill. The rain came at the 3rd armful. It came sideways, in a hard gray slant, and within minutes the passage flagstones she had scrubbed to gray were wet again with water blown through the 2 open window sockets. A slate went from the roof over the long room with a sound like a plate breaking on a stone floor. Then another. Alice pulled Hetty's shawl tight, took up the brass ferruled stick, and went from room to room shutting what could be shut. She was on her knees in the dining room, wedging the fallen shutter back into its frame with a length of broken lath, when she heard the knocking at the side door. At first she thought it was a branch. Then she thought it was the door itself, banging in its warped frame. Then she heard, under the wind, a voice. A woman's voice, thin and torn, calling something that might have been please and might have been the name of a child. Alice ran down the passage in her wet skirt and pulled the side door open against the wind. On the step, streaming water, stood a woman of perhaps 30 in a soaked brown cloak, holding a small boy of 5 or 6 against her hip, with an older girl of about 9 gripping her free hand. The girl's boots were split at the toe. The woman's face was the color of wet paper. Behind them, in the whipping grass of the bowl, a bay horse stood with its head down and its harness broken at the trace, dragging a snapped shaft. "I saw the chimney smoke," the woman said. There was no chimney smoke. Alice understood that the woman meant the chimneys themselves, standing above the trees, and had been navigating by them. "The trap went into the ditch by the ash. I could not lift it. The children—" "Come in," Alice said. She stepped back and pulled the door wide, and the woman staggered past her with the boy, and the girl slipped on the wet flagstones, and Alice caught her under the arm. She took them down the passage to the housekeeper's parlor, where the fire she had not yet lit was laid, and she knelt at the hearth and struck the flint 3 times before it took. And the small flame caught and rose in the dry kindling, and threw the first warm light that room had held in 30 years. The woman sank against the wall by the fire with the boy in her lap. The girl stood staring at the flame as if she had never seen a hearth before. Alice unwrapped Hetty's shawl from her own shoulders and put it around the woman. She took her second candle from the sill and lit it and put it in the tin cup on the mantel. She fetched the bread and cheese from her satchel and cut them into portions with Hetty's paring knife, and she gave the largest portion to the girl, who ate it in silence with her eyes on the fire. The horse," the woman said. "I will see to the horse," Alice said. She went out again into the rain with the brass-ferruled stick and Hetty's father's gloves, and led the bay round to the lee of the west wall of the house, where the leaning stone broke the worst of the wind. She unbuckled the broken harness with fingers that had stopped feeling anything, and let the traces fall. She brought the horse a bucket of clean rainwater from the porch, and left it standing with its head down against the wall, which was what the wall had always been for. Back inside, she found the boy asleep against his mother's chest, and the girl sitting cross-legged in front of the fire with her hands held out. Alice added another piece of wood. "What is this place?" the woman asked. Her voice was steadier now. Alice looked at the room, the scrubbed sill, the mended pane, the iron box in the light, the fire, the 3 faces it lit. She thought of Aunt Susanna's letter, and of the words "a roof" that belonged to her before it belonged to anyone else. She thought of her grandmother, and of the sheet drawn over the walnut table in the scullery for 30 years, and of the round young hand that had written, "I could not. Forgive me. It is called Long Hollow," she said. "It is mine." She had not said it aloud before, to anyone. Once she had said it, the wind outside seemed to drop a note, and the fire steadied, and the girl by the hearth turned her face and looked at Alice for the first time, with the slow attention children give to something they have decided to trust. Alice went to the window and set her palm flat on the iron box, and she stayed there listening to the storm and to the breathing of the 3 strangers behind her. And she understood that she had, in the space of a single afternoon, stopped being a girl with no address. The storm blew itself out before dawn. Alice slept sitting against the wall by the hearth, with the girl's head heavy on her shoulder and the fire down to red bones. When first light came gray through the mended pane, the wind had gone and the bowl of ground outside stood full of a still white mist, and the chestnut ring rose out of it dark and dripping like the rim of a bowl of milk. The woman woke and did not at first know where she was. Then she saw Alice and the fire and the iron box on the sill, and she wept quietly into the boy's hair without waking him. Her name was Ellen Marsh. She had been driving from her sister's house at Nettlebridge to her husband's people at Muirfold, because her husband had gone ahead a fortnight before to take a curacy there, and she had not wished to travel in the storm, but had misjudged the sky. The girl was called Jane. The boy was Tom. Ellen said all this in a low, exhausted voice, and Alice listened without interrupting. And when Ellen had finished, Alice cut the last of the bread and gave it to her. By mid-morning, Alice had the bay horse quieted, and the broken shaft lashed with linen thread, and a length of ash lath from the fallen shutter. It would not carry a trap, but it would carry a woman and 2 children the 3.5 miles to the boundary stone. Wilkin came at noon, earlier than promised, because he had heard the storm from Nettlebridge, and had guessed. He took one look at the woman and the children and the horse, said nothing, and helped them into the cart with the practiced gentleness of a man used to moving what was fragile. At Hetty's gate, Hetty came out in her gray shawl and took Ellen Marsh's hand, as she had once taken Alice's, and led the three of them inside without a word. That evening, the curate walked down the lane from the vicarage with his hat in his hand, having received word of his wife by the butcher's boy, and stood a long minute on Hetty's threshold, looking at Alice before he could speak. He said, "You sheltered them." Alice said, "The house did." The curate looked at her for another long moment, and then he bowed slightly, as a man bows to something he does not yet fully understand, and went in to his wife. The story went through Muirfold the way water goes through a dry field. By the following market day, the freckled boy's mother stopped Alice in the square and pressed a jar of honey into her hands, and did not meet her eye. The postmaster's wife came to Hetty's door with a bundle of clean linen and said that she had been thinking, and that there had been talk in her mother's time of a great-aunt at Nettlebridge who had owned a house and been made much trouble over it, and that she was sorry to have said what she had said. The wheelwright returned the crowbar himself and refused a shilling, and asked whether Alice needed a stronger tool, because he had a good pry-bar he was not using. Outsiders began arriving on the Nettlebridge road. A land agent came from the county town in a black gig and walked the bowl of ground with Alice and made notes on a small pad. A surveyor came the following week and paced the boundaries. A slater from 2 parishes over left his cart at the ash tree and walked down to the manor to look at the roof, and stayed an hour, and said the slate could be saved if the ridge were mended before winter. The kind professional came last, as such men do. He was a solicitor from the county town, a spare grey man with ink at his cuff, whose name Alice would afterwards remember was Mr. Adair. He sat at Hetty's parlour table and read the deed of April 1839 twice, and then the letters of Aunt Susanna, and then the little red ledger. And at the end he laid his hands flat on the papers and looked at Alice for a long moment before he spoke. "This is in order," he said. "Long Hollow is yours. It has been yours since your grandmother's death." He said it quietly, as if it were the plainest fact in the room, which by then it was. Mr. Rufus Bardsley heard it before the day was out. He came to Hetty's gate the following afternoon in the same fawn waistcoat, without the walking stick, and stood on the path a full minute before he knocked. When Alice came to the door, he took his hat off and held it in both hands. He said, "Miss Shaw, I spoke ill of you in the Green Bell." Alice waited. He said, "I did not know the house. I did not know the woman." Alice said, "Few did." He nodded once, put the hat back on, and went away down the lane. He did not laugh at her again, in the square or anywhere else, and the men who had laughed behind him found other subjects. The chorus that had whispered at Hetty's window in the first week now stood at a respectful distance when Alice passed and touched their caps. It was not affection. Alice did not mistake it for affection. It was the slow, grave reverence a country parish gives to a person who has proved to be, against all its earlier reckoning, exactly what she had said she was. By the end of that season, the ridge of Long Hollow's roof had been mended. The 2 open window sockets had been shuttered against the coming frost, and the jackdaws had raised their brood and gone. Alice moved into the housekeeper's parlour properly at Michaelmas, with a small iron bed brought on Wilkins' cart, and a kettle from Hetty, and a tortoise-shell cat called Muffet, who had, after much consultation between Hetty and Alice, been judged old enough to choose her own house. The walnut sewing table came too. Alice set it in the long room by the tall window, where the light was best, and did not cover it with a sheet. On an evening in October, with the chestnut ring gone bronze and the low sun laying long gold across the bowl of ground, Alice stood on the mended step of the porch, with Muffet against her ankle and the brass-ferruled stick in her hand, and she watched the light move across the grey stone of the west wall. Hetty was behind her in the passage, setting a lamp. Ellen Marsh's girl Jane, who came now on Saturdays to learn her letters at Hetty's insistence, was cutting a late apple in the kitchen. The fern inlay on the mantelpiece had been cleaned. The tin plate had been drawn from the walnut leg with a claw hammer and thrown into the hedge, and beneath it, as Alice had known would be there, was a small oval of pale stone engraved with the same fern and the same word. Hetty came out onto the porch and stood beside her and said, "You have made something." Alice looked at the house, and at the ring of chestnuts, and at the long gold across the wall, and she said, "I have kept what was meant to be kept." She said it plainly, without lifting her voice, the way her grandmother had once threaded a needle by the sill without looking down. Hetty put a hand briefly on her shoulder and went back inside, and Alice stood a little longer on the step in the last of the light, and the light moved on, and the evening came down soft and blue over Longhollow, and the house behind her breathed once, and settled, and held. Thank you for staying to the end of this quiet, stubborn story about a girl, a table, and a house that would not stay hidden. If the slow honor of things kept and things reclaimed moved you, leave a kind word below, tap the like, and follow along for the next tale we tell by the hedgerow and the hearth.